You can have it all, just not all at the same time. We can no longer ignore that voice within women that says, I want something more than my husband and my children and my home. No woman gets an orgasm from shining the kitchen floor. When she stopped conforming to the conventional picture of femininity, she finally began to enjoy being a woman. A girl should not expect special privileges because of her sex, but neither should she adjust to prejudice and discrimination. The feminine mystique has succeeded in burying millions of American women alive. The feminist revolution had to be fought because women, quite simply, were stopped at a state of evolution far short of their human capacity. It is both an irony and an indictment of the feminine mystique that it often forced the unhappy ones, the ugly ducklings, to find themselves, while girls who fitted the image became adjusted, happy housewives and have never found out who they are. We broke through the feminine mystique, and women who were wives, mothers, and housewives began to find themselves as people. That didn't mean they stopped or had to stop being mothers, wives, or even liking their homes. The feminists had destroyed the old image of woman, but they could not erase the hostility, the prejudice, the discrimination that still remained. Advice? I don't offer advice. Not my business. Your life is what you make it. The only way for a woman, as for a man, to find herself, to know herself as a person, is by creative work of her own. A good woman is one who loves passionately, has guts, seriousness, and passionate convictions, takes responsibility, and shapes society. A woman has got to be able to say, and not feel guilty, who am I, and what do I want out of life? She mustn't feel selfish and neurotic if she wants goals of her own outside of husband and children. Why should women accept this picture of a half-life instead of a share in the whole of human destiny? The problem that has no name, which is simply the fact that American women are kept from growing to their full human capacities, is taking a far greater toll on the physical and mental health of our country than any known disease. By now, abortion should be obsolete, and I and probably a lot of other feminists wish it were obsolete, because abortion in itself is not a value, it is simply the right to choose, which is an essential value. I understood somehow my mother's frustration, and that it was no good, not only for her, but for her children or her husband, that she didn't have a real use of her ability. Men weren't really the enemy. They were fellow victims suffering from an outmoded masculine mystique that made them feel unnecessarily inadequate when there were no bears to kill. It is frightening when a woman finally realizes that there is no answer to the question, who am I, except the voice inside herself. We need a new political movement of women and men toward a new society. Regardless of your age, you will always have adventures, unexpected joys, and unexpected sorrows. Dominance is a burden. Most men who are honest will admit that. I wouldn't be satisfied with a life lived solely on the barricades. I reserve my right to be frivolous. A woman is handicapped by her sex and handicaps society, either by slavishly copying the pattern of man's advance in the professions, or by refusing to compete with man at all. To protest free speech in the name of protecting women is dangerous and wrong. Instead of fulfilling the promise of infinite orgasmic bliss, sex in the America of the feminine mystique is becoming a strangely joyless national compulsion, if not a contemptuous mockery. Each woman is made to feel it is her own cross to bear if she can't be the perfect clone of the male Superman and the perfect clone of the feminine mystique. We need to see men and women as equal partners, but it's hard to think of movies that do that. When I talk to people, they think of movies of 45 years ago, Hepburn and Tracy. If divorce has increased by 1,000%, don't blame the women's movement, blame the obsolete sex roles on which our marriages were based. Chosen motherhood is the real liberation. The choice to have a child makes the whole experience of motherhood different, and the choice to be generative in other ways can at last be made, and is being made by many women now, without guilt. A woman today who has no goal, no purpose, no ambition, patterning her days into the future, making her stretch and grow beyond that small score of years in which her body can fill its biological function, is committing a kind of suicide. It is better for a woman to compete impersonally in society, as men do, than to compete for dominance in her own home with her husband, compete with her neighbors for empty status, and so smother her son that he cannot compete at all. It is perhaps beside the point to remark that bowling alleys and supermarkets have nursery facilities, while schools and colleges and scientific laboratories and government offices do not. Diversity has got to be a part of modern feminism, and I think that my feminism is stronger because it's an inclusive thing. I won't be backed into a corner that polarizes me against other women, and I wished they wouldn't be either. Aging will create the music of the coming century. If I were a man, I would strenuously object to the assumption that women have any moral or spiritual superiority as a class. I would have much rather been in the jalopy with the kids, going to hunts for hamburgers, but when I entered high school, all my friends got into sororities and fraternities and I didn't. You have to say no to the old ways before you can begin to find the new. Yes, you need. Our daughters grow up with the same possibilities as our sons. When one begins to think about it, America depends rather heavily on women's passive dependence. Their femininity, if one still wants to call it that, makes American women a target and a victim of the sexual cell. The insult, the real reflection on our culture's definition of the role of women, is that as a nation, we only noticed something was wrong with women when we saw its effects on their sons. Protectiveness has often muffled the sound of doors closing against women. It has often cloaked a very real prejudice, even when it is offered in the name of science. I realized that what I was saying was threatening somehow to the editors of women's magazines, that it threatened the very world they were trying to paint what I then called the feminine mystique. American women were frustrated in just the role of housewife, but they also managed to enlarge it, and they weren't just housewives, they were community leaders. There was a strange discrepancy between the reality of our lives as women and the image to which we were trying to conform, the image that I came to call the feminine mystique. Most of the people in the workforce today will spend some years when they also have children and family responsibilities. Women, because they are not generally the principal breadwinners, can be perhaps most useful as the trailblazers, working along the bypaths, doing the unusual job that men cannot afford to gamble on. The unpleasant image of the feminists today resembles less the feminists themselves than the image fostered by the interests who so bitterly opposed the vote for women. I can't point to any major episodes of sexual discrimination in my early life, but I was so aware of the crime, the shame, that there was no use of my mother's ability and energy. There is absolutely no evidence that it is harmful to children if their mother's health, well-being, and autonomy and control of her own destiny is maximized by work outside the home. Whatever I wrote was heretical. It offended the editors of the women's magazines. When I was in high school, even in college, I didn't have any real image of a career woman or a professional woman. The situation of women and men is not comparable to worker boss or black and white. Just as darkness is sometimes defined as the absence of light, so age is defined as the absence of youth. I have discovered that there is a crucial difference between society's image of old people and us as we know and feel ourselves to be. While I had been, I guess, quite brilliant academically in my college years, I also had been editor of the paper, and I loved that, and that was a much more active thing, and I missed it when I was doing graduate work. Women's sexual problems are, in this sense, byproducts of the suppression of her basic need to grow and fulfill her potentialities as a human being, potentialities which the mystique of feminine fulfillment ignores. I didn't want to be in a situation where I was broader than the boys, which I was in the academic world. If you were very bright and you became head of a department, as I did, of the psychology department, you were encouraged to go on to graduate work. But as a woman, you didn't even think about discrimination. There is something less than fully human in those who have never known a commitment to an idea, who have never risked an exploration of the unknown, who have never attempted the kind of creativity of which men and women are potentially capable. A woman who is herself only a sexual object lives finally in a world of objects, unable to touch in others the individual identity she lacks herself. After the Depression, after the war, Freudian psychology became much more than a science of human behavior, a therapy for the suffering. It became an all-embracing American ideology, a new religion. You can show more of the reality of yourself instead of hiding behind a mask for fear of revealing too much. Betty Friedan, February 4, 1921, February 4, 2006, was born Betty Naomi Goldstein in Peoria, Illinois, to Harry and Miriam Horwitz Goldstein, whose Jewish families were from Russia and Hungary. Harry owned a jewelry store in Peoria, and Miriam wrote for the society page of a newspaper. When Friedan's father fell ill, her mother's new life outside the home seemed much more gratifying. As a young girl, Friedan was active in both Marxist and Jewish circles. She attended Peoria High School and became involved in the school newspaper. Friedan attended the Women's Smith College in 1938. She won a scholarship prize in her first year for outstanding academic performance. In her second year, she became interested in poetry and had many poems published in campus publications. In 1941, she became editor-in-chief of Scan-Smith College Associated News. The editorials became more political under her leadership, taking a strong anti-war stance and occasionally causing controversy. She graduated summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa in 1942 with a major in psychology. She lived in Chapin House during her time at Smith. In 1943, she spent a year at the University of California, Berkeley on a fellowship for graduate work in psychology with Erik Erikson. She became more politically active, continuing to mix with Marxists. Many of her friends were investigated by the FBI. In her memoirs, she claimed that her boyfriend at the time had pressured her into turning down a PhD fellowship for further study and abandoning her academic career. Betty Friedan was an American feminist writer and activist, a leading figure in the women's movement in the United States. Her 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, is often credited with sparking the second wave of American feminism in the 20th century. In 1966, Friedan co-founded and was elected the first president of the National Organization for Women Now, which aimed to bring women into the mainstream of American society, now fully equal partnership with men. In 1970, after stepping down as Now's first president, Friedan organized the nationwide Women's Strike for Equality on August 26, the 50th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution granting women the right to vote. The national strike was successful beyond expectations in broadening the feminist movement. The march led by Friedan in New York City alone attracted over 50,000 people. In 1971, Friedan joined other leading feminists to establish the National Women's Political Caucus. Friedan was also a strong supporter of the proposed Equal Rights Amendment to the United States Constitution that passed the United States House of Representatives by a vote of 354-24 and Senate 80-8 following intense pressure by women's groups led by Now. In the early 1970s, following congressional passage of the amendment, Friedan advocated ratification of the amendment in the states and supported other women's rights reforms. She founded the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, but was later critical of the abortion-centered positions of many liberal feminists. Regarded as an influential author and intellectual in the United States, Friedan remained active in politics and advocacy until the late 1990s, authoring 6 books. As early as the 1960s, Friedan was critical of polarized and extreme factions of feminism that attacked groups such as men and homemakers. One of her later books, The Second Stage 1981, critiqued what Friedan saw as the extremist excesses of some feminists.